The date is 1964. The room is silent, save for a low, rhythmic electronic hum that seems to vibrate in the very bones of the occupant. A figure lies still, strapped to a chair, tubes leading into the arm. For days, perhaps weeks, this individual has not seen the sun. They are awake, yet utterly paralyzed by the cocktail of paralyzing agents and powerful psychoactive substances flooding their system. They are listening to a voice, a relentless loop of instruction played over and over through hidden speakers, designed not to teach, but to strip away the self. How did a celebrated psychiatric facility in Montreal become the testing ground for the most extreme psychological warfare ever conceived by an intelligence agency? How did the mandate of healing become the mechanism for systematic destruction? The answer lies buried beneath decades of institutional silence, within the classified files of the CIA's Operation MKUltra. But the true horror is not just that drugs were used, it's that the victims were not spies or enemies of the state, but ordinary Canadian citizens seeking help. The revelation that this was all part of MKUltra Subproject 119 reframes everything we thought we knew about medical trust. The year is 1953. The Cold War is freezing over and the fear of communist brainwashing reaches a fever pitch in Washington. The mandate is clear. Find a method to control the human mind, to extract information, or to shatter an enemy's will. The CIA officially sanctions MKUltra, pouring millions into research aimed at chemical interrogation and behavior modification. The goal is absolute psychological dominance. Across the border, in the hallowed halls of McGill University, the Allen Memorial Institute, a beacon of psychiatric research, is becoming the epicenter of this clandestine American agenda. Officially, the work falls under Subproject 68, but the underlying directive, the very blueprint for the assault on the mind, is traced back to the foundational research of Subproject 119, an early electromagnetic program that set the stage for what came next. In the early 1950s, the funding begins to flow, channeled through shadowy organizations like the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research, bypassing direct oversight. The doctors here were not working in a vacuum. They were executing a foreign intelligence directive under the guise of innovation. The techniques sound like science fiction, but they were administered with chilling administrative precision. The subjects, seeking relief from depression, anxiety, or simple insomnia, are ushered into specialized rooms. The air is thick with a sterile medicinal odor, underscored by a faint, nearly imperceptible electronic tone. The initial phase involves what they call depatterning. This is achieved through a combination of induced coma and brutal electrical assaults. Imagine receiving electroshock therapy, not once or twice, but administered at levels up to 75 times the normal clinical intensity. The body convulses, the mind is scoured clean, leaving behind a terrifying blank slate. But the physical shock was only the prelude to the most insidious phase. Once the patient was sufficiently vulnerable, the drug trials began. LSD, mescaline, and other agents are introduced, often without the patient's knowledge that they are even receiving an experimental compound. The CIA demands results: memory erasure, suggestibility enhancement, complete behavioral restructuring. The relentless audio torture, known chillingly as psychic driving, begins. Picture a patient confined to a small, dark space, unable to move, forced to absorb specific recorded messages. The voice of the leading physician loops endlessly, sometimes for 16 hours a day. The repetition is astronomical. Some patients endured hearing the same phrases 500,000 times. This constant sonic bombardment is designed to overwrite the core personality structure. The result? Patients become unable to recall memories, adrift in confusion, their identities fundamentally compromised. The official timeline shows the experiments peaking between 1957 and 1964. During this period, the Allen Memorial Institute became a laboratory where the sanctity of patient autonomy was systematically violated. Think of the clinical environment, the polished floors reflecting the dim, harsh institutional lighting, the weight of the restraints, and the absolute power held by the men in white coats who held the keys to the medication cabinets. They were not treating illness, they were testing the limits of human psychological endurance. All documented, all funded by the CIA. The knowledge gap widens when we consider the scope of the cover-up. When these activities were finally exposed in 1975, following official halts to MKUltra in 1973, the public was stunned. But the true casualty was the trust between citizen and institution. When the public learned that the CIA was directly funding mind control experiments at the Institute, the damage to Canada's sovereignty and its medical ethics was irreparable. The toxic legacy speaks of soul stripping, a deep psychological dismantling that lasts a lifetime. The precise documentation connecting Subproject 119's initial electromagnetic theories to the specific LSD administration under Subproject 68 remains heavily obscured, locked away in archives. We know the drugs were used, we know the shocks were delivered, but the exact dosages, the quantitative measures of how much LSD was given to strip a soul bare, remains an unanswered question. We can only infer the intent from the wreckage left behind, the persistent trauma, the shattered recollections, the lives irrevocably altered by hidden hands pulling the strings from Langley, Virginia. The silence in those experimentation rooms was not peace, it was the sound of an identity being carefully, scientifically erased. Chapter 3. The Scar. The fallout was not immediate but corrosive, spreading slowly through the foundations of Canadian medicine and governance. When the dam of secrecy finally broke in the mid-1970s, the reaction was a mixture of outrage and profound national embarrassment. The Church Committee hearings in the United States dragged the details into the harsh glare of public scrutiny, but it was the Canadian response, or lack thereof, that truly defined the scar left by MKUltra. In Canada, the initial official position was one of guarded denial, followed by a slow, agonizing admission that certain activities had occurred without full governmental oversight. Yet for the survivors, the official inquiries felt hollow. They were not searching for a political admission, they were seeking recognition for the violation of their very being. The names of the doctors involved, once lauded figures in psychiatry, became synonymous with betrayal. They had taken an oath to do no harm, and instead they had participated in a systematic campaign of engineered harm, funded by a foreign power. Consider the aftermath for the victims. Many were left institutionalized, diagnosed with schizophrenia or severe personality disorders. Their documented histories riddled with gaps, hallucinations, and debilitating paranoia, symptoms that were not the original ailment, but the intended consequence of the experiments. They were told their breakdowns were due to underlying weakness, that the terrifying memories of being held down while voices screamed instructions were merely drug-induced nightmares. The medical records, often deliberately sparse or coded, served as the final layer of institutional gaslighting. The true cost of Subproject 119 and its successors cannot be measured in dollars or in suppressed documents. It is measured in the lost potential of hundreds of lives. A young student, admitted for mild anxiety after the loss of a parent, might have been subjected to the electroshock regimes and LSD protocols, emerging weeks later unable to hold a coherent thought, the ambition meticulously shocked out of them. A new mother struggling with postpartum depression, seeking solace, instead found herself a subject in a quest for mind control, her capacity for maternal bonding potentially chemically altered or destroyed. The institutional response post-1975 focused heavily on procedural reform. New ethical guidelines were drafted. Informed consent became a cornerstone, at least on paper, of all medical trials. But these reforms were band-aids applied to a mortal wound. The damage done at the Allen Memorial Institute highlighted a fundamental vulnerability: the reliance on the integrity of the medical elite. When that integrity is compromised by national security objectives, the system has no internal mechanism strong enough to halt the destruction. The legacy of Operation MKUltra in Canada is not just about the CIA, it is about the complicity of Canadian institutions willing to entertain the possibility of selling their patients for the perceived security or scientific prestige offered by American collaborators. The electronic hum that characterized the early experiments, the faint, underlying frequency designed to prime the brain for suggestion, never truly faded from the national consciousness. It became the subtle, persistent static of mistrust. The surviving documentation, though fragmented, reveals a pattern of behavior that transcends simple ethical lapses. It points to a cold, calculating utilitarianism where the individual human being was reduced to a data point, an organic machine whose hard drive could be wiped clean and rewritten for strategic advantage. The sheer audacity required to use the deepest vulnerability of the sick, their desperate need for healing, as the vector for psychological demolition is almost incomprehensible. This is where the threads of Subproject 119, The theoretical groundwork in electromagnetic influence and the drug regimes of Subproject 68 converge. If 119 sought to map the brain's susceptibility to external frequencies, 68 sought to chemically prime that mapped terrain, making the subsequent suggestion insertion easier. The doctors were not merely drugging patients, they were attempting to create a perfect conduit for external command. The aftermath forced a reckoning in the Canadian government regarding its oversight of psychiatric research. In 1977, the Canadian Senate conducted its own investigation, attempting to quantify the damage. The findings were grim, a pattern of experimentation that was both scientifically questionable and morally bankrupt. Yet, accountability was elusive. Key figures retired or moved on, protected by the very secrecy that had enabled the atrocities. The lawsuits